All houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses. Through the open doors, the harmless phantoms on their errands glide, with feet that make no sound upon the floors. We meet them at the doorway, on the stair, along the passages they come and go, impalpable impressions on the air, a sense of something moving to and fro. That's the poem Haunted Houses by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I think he was onto something. See, we don't know exactly what makes certain houses become haunted, but if there's one factor that they all seem to have in common, it isn't death necessarily, but it is tragedy, pain, emotional anguish of some sort, something of that emotion that kind of sticks to a place. It's like the flash of a camera that makes that image imprint onto the place. Now, the first restaurant I ever worked in was incredibly haunted. And the story around the restaurant from everybody who worked there was that it was obvious why it was haunted. They said that a hangman's tree used to stand right where the back room of that restaurant now was. That hangman's tree, in the Old West days, this is in Temecula, an Old West town, and they said that back in the day in the 1800s, they would hang criminals and horse thieves from that tree, and that tree stood right where that back room is. Now, it's a fact that everybody was creeped out by that back room. Dane was the first person to tell me about it. He was a waiter there, and he told me that he doesn't work nights anymore. He said he used to. One night he was setting out the silverware, the little silverware settings wrapped up in napkins, and he was setting them all out on all the tables. And then he went into that back room. The back room was always darker, no matter how high they turned the lights up. And Dane went back there and set all the settings on the tables. And then he went back to the kitchen to get some more. He was only gone for about 5 seconds, and he came back in. All the silverware was piled up in a big pile on the center table. Nobody else was around. The doors were locked. So Dane didn't work nights anymore. I talked to a dishwasher who didn't work nights anymore. He said he was washing dishes late one night there, and then he was coming on out through that back dark room. And as he was walking through it, he saw somebody standing in the middle of the room. A little girl in an old West dress. He said she was like those people on that Little House on the Prairie show. She had a bonnet on. Well, he kind of looked behind him to see, does anybody see this? He looked back and she was gone. I talked to another dishwasher who didn't work nights anymore. They were pretty short-staffed at night. The other dishwasher said he was in the kitchen washing dishes all by himself when he felt somebody come up and just tap him on the shoulder roughly. He turned around and nobody was there, just a big, dark, empty kitchen behind him. Now, even the manager, even the owner of the restaurant had experienced these phenomena. The owner told me once she and the managers and all of the top brass of the restaurant, when it had closed down and all the employees had left, they would all hang around talking about the day, and they'd have some steins of beer and they'd be smoking cigarettes in the lobby. And they were all hanging around one evening pretty late talking to each other, and then they looked at this stein of beer that was just sitting on a table kind of far off from them, and it started to move across that table slowly, and then it got faster and faster till it flew off the table and shattered against the wall. Everyone saw it. Now, again, the reason they gave was the tragedy, the pain, the suffering of that hangman's tree, all those people who died that painful death on that hangman's tree. That was a long time ago, more than 20 years ago now, that I worked at that restaurant. And many years passed, and now as an adult and as an author, I decided to research it. I thought, is this true? Was there a hangman's tree on that spot? And I looked into the records. I went digging deep into the old historical records of old Temecula, and I found that, in fact, in the same shopping center where this restaurant is, it used to be called Tony's Spunky Steer, and it was RJ's Sizzle and Steer after that. And in that same shopping center, not very far away at all, just a few yards away, there's an old adobe house, and it's the oldest standing adobe house in Temecula, California, built in 1879. It's the Gonzalez house, the Gonzalez adobe. It was built by the local accountant, Jose Gonzalez. And he built it. So I started looking into it. Okay, well, maybe there was a little settlement around his house. Maybe there was a hangman's tree. And no, there wasn't. Not at all. The only people who lived on that property or anywhere nearby was Mr. Gonzalez and his wife and his children. Now, I know people were strict with discipline back then, but I don't think they would hang their own kids for stealing a cookie from the cookie jar. So no, there was no hangman's tree there. So why the hauntings? Why the phenomena? Well, even if there were no hangings and no executions, there was plenty of anguish and plenty of sadness associated with that spot. And a lot of that goes back to a guest of Mr. Gonzalez's, a woman who lived with his family for several years. She was Mrs. Mercedes Pujol. Now, Mercedes Pujol, she had a hard life, and her life was marked by suffering. She wasn't poor. She was wealthy. She came from a well-to-do family in Spain. And one of the big landowners, one of the owners of so much of the land that is now Temecula, this man was Mr. Domingo Pujol. And so he went back to the old country, back to Spain to look for a wife. And he, through family connections, he found this well-off family and he met Mercedes. He met her and they did fall in love and they were married in Spain. He said, okay, I'll go back to California now. I'm going to get my affairs in order and I'll send for you. Well, he came back to California, then he got sick. He died immediately. So Mercedes Pujol, she inherited his wealth, but she inherited that sadness too, that tragedy. The tragedy of being a woman without a husband in a time when it was difficult to be a single woman anywhere. But she was strong. She was tough. She made the most of it. She came back and she set aside the land grants and the parcels of what became Temecula. She created Temecula. She set aside parcels of land for the school, for the church. She divided it up and she set up the layout of that town. She created that town of Temecula. And yet she never really had a family of her own. She didn't have children of her own. She never really belonged. She was far away from her homeland in Spain and off in this strange desert land here on the west coast of this continent. And so she lived as a guest with Mr. Gonzalez, the accountant. She was a guest in their home, but I imagine she always felt like an outsider. I imagine she spent a lot of sleepless nights wondering what might have happened, what her life could have looked like if only her husband hadn't died so soon. So I feel like that sadness could imprint itself onto that place. Now, when I thought about Mercedes Pujol and her story, I decided to go back to that restaurant and see if this phenomenon is still happening. Well, I went back and it's not a steakhouse at all anymore. The steakhouse, RJ's Sizzle and Steer, they've moved across to Murrieta. You can go eat their steaks. They're delicious steaks, and they didn't pay me to say that. You can try their steaks, but if you go to this original restaurant, it's an Indian food restaurant. And I asked them if they had experienced anything. Nobody wanted to really talk about it. So I started asking around the rest of the shopping center, and I went across the way to what used to be a Nazarene church, but now it's a preschool. And I started talking to them, and I told them how I was researching this old haunted restaurant. And they said, really? This preschool is super haunted. And the teacher I spoke with, she told me about half a dozen stories about phenomena in that preschool too. Doors opening and slamming shut all by themselves, footsteps when nobody's around. And a few people have seen a little girl when the children have all left. And I wonder if it is that same little girl. Maybe it's Mr. Gonzalez's daughter. And she herself, she said that she was there all by herself when all the children were gone. And she was in the room with all the toys. And they had a big flat drum. And that flat drum, the kids loved to play with it. It was just kind of sitting flat on the floor. And she was about to leave that room and she noticed that drum start sliding across the floor, a lot like that Bierstein did back in the restaurant. Starts sliding across the floor and it slides over into the other room. And then once it's in the other room, she heard boom, 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 boom. He didn't stick around to check it out. She left without even locking the door. Something is still there. Something's stuck to that place. Now, it doesn't have to be frightening. It doesn't have to be sinister. Maybe it's just the sadness. Maybe it's Mercedes Pujol's sadness that has imprinted itself on that place. Maybe that's the ghost that is still there, that ghost of things and dreams that never were. Because all houses wherein men have lived and died are haunted houses. Through the open doors, the harmless phantoms on their errands glide with feet that make no sound upon the floors. The haunted restaurant of Temecula.